Hey guys, tonight we're going straight into the kind of family drama that makes your stomach twist before the first 10 minutes are over. My own daughter came storming through my front door, chin tilted high like she'd rehearsed the role of prosecutor all night, and she demanded my house keys. Her hand was outstretched, sharp nails tapping against her palm, waiting for me to just surrender everything I had left. But the truth, the delicious, shocking, and maybe foolish truth, was that I didn't even own the house anymore. I had sold it first quietly behind her back, and I stood there with a half smile that she read as defiance, but was really just relief. You probably won't survive this story if you're hoping for something clean and wholesome, because this is about betrayal in its most domestic form. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Tell me where you're tuning in, from which city, which town, which tiny village. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's comfortably embark on tonight's journey. The moment she stood there demanding those keys, I felt like I had been stripped naked in my own living room. Family dynamics often spiral around power and control. It's not just about affection, it's about who holds the authority, who sets the rules. Psychologists talk about role reversal when children grow up and suddenly start treating parents like dependents. And in that moment, my daughter wasn't asking, she was commanding, like the script had flipped, and I was the unruly teenager who had lost my way. I laughed not out loud, just inside my head, because people still debate whether children ever truly forgive their parents for choosing survival over appearances. Her voice carried this brittle confidence, the kind that sounds like glass before it shatters. She said she needed the keys because she planned to secure her inheritance. That word stung, inheritance, as if my entire life, every corner of that home, every memory carved into those walls was nothing more than a savings account for her future. Odd fact, in some countries like France, inheritance law automatically grants children a fixed share of their parents' property, whether the parents agree or not. But this wasn't France. This was me, standing with a set of keys I didn't even need anymore, wondering if I should tell her the truth or let her claw through shadows for a while. I wanted to ask her, when did you stop seeing me as your mother and start seeing me as a vault? When did our conversation shift from, how are you doing, to what are you leaving behind? But I didn't ask. I just watched her arms folded, my back leaning against the counter, the way people lean against the edge of a cliff, knowing there's nothing but air below. The sale had been simple, almost too simple. Real estate agents love to say, your home isn't a home, it's a product. I hated that phrase, but it was true. I needed cash, and selling the house gave me the one thing I hadn't had in years' choice. But here's the joke. I didn't buy myself a yacht, didn't run away to Paris. I moved into a smaller apartment that smelled faintly of onions from the neighbors' endless cooking. Still standing in that stale kitchen, I felt freer than I had in years. Yet freedom to a parent often looks like betrayal to a child. She slammed her hand on the table. Yes, I jumped and demanded again. This time she said, we need to protect what's ours, ours. Funny how that word comes out of someone's mouth when they haven't paid a dime toward the mortgage, when they never scrubbed mold from the basement walls, when they didn't sit up at night calculating which bills to pay late so the lights wouldn't go out. But I bit my tongue. Because here's another mainstream fact: families often fracture, not because of strangers, but because of money. Studies show that inheritance conflicts are one of the leading reasons siblings stop speaking to each other. And here, she was not even waiting for me to die, already cutting into the pie she thought existed. The room was heavy. I swear you could have sliced the air with a butter knife and still gotten stuck halfway. She looked at me like she was waiting for a confession, maybe expecting me to beg her for forgiveness. And you know what I almost did? Old habits die hard, and the habit of wanting your child's approval is one of the hardest chains to break. But then the oddest thought popped into my head about ancient Roman families. They used to have this ritual where the paterfamilias, the family head, could literally disown a child with a ceremonial act declaring them no longer kin. Imagine the awkward family dinner after that. People still debate whether those harsh customs kept families loyal or just fueled rebellion. I didn't disown her, of course, but I also didn't hand her the keys. I told her they weren't here, and she squinted at me like she could smell a lie. Technically, it wasn't a lie. The keys were gone useless, like trying to open a door that had been bricked over. And then, here comes the joke I promised you. I realized I was standing in my own kitchen, arguing about keys I didn't have in a house that technically wasn't even mine, with a daughter who thought she was starring in a courtroom drama. It felt like bad improv, and I half expected a director to shout "cut" from behind the curtains. Her anger didn't fizzle. It sharpened. She accused me of betrayal, of hiding things, of choosing myself over family. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either. That's the thing about family betrayals. They're rarely neat, rarely one-sided. I wondered what the neighbors could hear through the walls. Maybe they were sipping tea, enjoying this real-life soap opera, debating whether I was the villain or just a tired parent who had finally drawn a boundary. Boundaries, by the way, are one of the most misunderstood parts of family life. People still debate whether setting them is an act of love or an act of cruelty. I stood firm. My palms were sweaty, my throat dry, but my voice came out steady. I told her I'd explain everything, just not today. That was my mistake. Because when you leave a wound open without stitches, it festers. She stormed out, heels cracking against the tiles like gunshots, and the silence she left behind was almost louder than her shouting. I sat down, hands pressed flat against the cool surface of the table, realizing that in one evening I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Selling the house was one thing. Telling her she had no right to it, that was another. And though I pretended to feel calm deep inside, I knew the battle had only just begun. I wake the next morning still tasting the metallic aftershock of her anger. Sleep didn't come easy. It never does after a fight that feels like it tore something invisible inside the walls. I roll over and stare at the ceiling, the familiar cracks now resembling the branching veins of an old family tree. It makes me laugh quietly, because doesn't every family tree eventually split bend and break under the weight of secrets? That's what we don't talk about at reunions, but it's what really haunts the lineage. I remember clearly the day I sold the house. I walked into the realtor's office with a folder that felt heavier than bricks, though it was only paper. Papers of my life, the deed, the mortgage history, my signatures etched in ballpoint over decades. Selling it wasn't some impulsive act. It was a survival decision, the kind that makes you clutch your coat tighter and look both ways even when the street is empty. People love to say, home is where the heart is. No, home is where the bills come. And when the bills drown you, the heart suffocates. I needed to let go. My body was tired of dragging around memories like chains tied to my ankles. Every room in that house held echoes of arguments, laughter, slammed doors, and once, even the muffled sobbing I thought no one heard. But houses have ears. They remember even when people forget. When I signed the sale, I felt lighter, as though the house had finally exhaled and let me walk free. Of course, selling it without telling my daughter was like lighting a fuse. Family scholars often mention the sandwich generation, those parents trapped between caring for their children and their aging parents. I was the sandwich filling pressed until I crumbled. And like many people in that position, I didn't announce my desperation, I just acted. People still debate whether it's braver to suffer in silence or to make bold choices that anger everyone around you. What makes me laugh darkly, of course, is that I didn't sell the house for luxury. I didn't move to the Bahamas or buy silk pajamas. No, I traded a 4-bedroom suburban tomb for a modest apartment where the walls are thin enough that I can hear my neighbor's dog sneezing. It's humbling and humiliating depending on how you look at it. But freedom sometimes smells like onion soup from next door and squeaky pipes that groan in the night. The day I told the realtor yes, I watched her nod briskly, tapping on her computer, already calculating her commission. I wondered what she'd say if I told her that this wasn't just property, it was a battlefield. Families have lost kingdoms over land. I was about to lose my daughter over a mortgage-free bungalow. Did she know she was holding the detonator? Probably not. When I walked out of that office with the ink still drying, I thought about how some cultures see homes as sacred. In Japan, for example, there's the concept of IE, meaning not just house, but family, lineage, heritage, continuity. Selling a home there isn't just financial, it's almost spiritual betrayal. I thought about that as I handed over my keys. Maybe to my daughter, I had just sold her soul without permission. And yet, I remember the peculiar joy of that first night in my new apartment. I lay on a mattress on the floor, surrounded by boxes, the air conditioning rattling like an old truck engine, and I laughed. Laughed because no one knew where I was. No one could tell me to paint the shutters, repair the fence, host Thanksgiving. It was mine, even if it was small. The joke I made to myself was that I had finally downsized the drama. But of course, drama doesn't shrink, it travels. The trouble is, when family feels blindsided, they rarely focus on the reasons. They focus on the betrayal. That's what my daughter couldn't forgive. In her eyes, I didn't just sell a house, I sold trust. Psychologists call it attachment rupture, and it's one of the hardest fractures to heal. People still debate whether you can ever really mend it, or whether every holiday dinner afterward tastes faintly of poison. The weeks after the sale, my phone rang constantly. My son wanted to know why he hadn't been consulted. My sister asked if I'd lost my mind. Even my neighbor, the one who once complained about my hedges, cornered me at the grocery store to say she was heartbroken about the news, like she had ever lived a day inside those walls. Everyone acted like they owned a piece of me, like my decisions were public property. It was a circus, and I was the clown juggling flames. And yet, amid all the accusations, a strange peace slipped in. I sat in my tiny living room sipping tea, watching the sun stripe across the faded carpet, and realized no one could take this away. This was mine. It was the kind of peace parents don't talk about, the relief of not being needed, not being the constant provider. Parents are expected to always give, but nobody teaches us how to stop giving without being labeled selfish. I thought about that one evening when I was unpacking. I found an old shoebox filled with photos, receipts, birthday cards with faded ink. I flipped through them, feeling like a thief rifling through someone else's life. And I whispered to myself, I sold the house, but I didn't sell these. It was a comfort, though a fragile one, because memories don't pay rent. Here's the ironic fringe detail that struck me in medieval England. A widow had a legal right to 1/3 of her husband's estate, called dower rights, even if his will tried to disinherit her. Entire feuds erupted over those laws, with sons accusing mothers of greed and betrayal. Standing in my cramped kitchen, I realized I had just become the villain in my daughter's medieval drama. She wasn't just mad about the house. She was fighting for her imagined rights. The tension thickened when she discovered the sale from someone else, my brother, who thought it was his civic duty to inform her. She called me screaming, accusing me of cowardice, of hiding like a criminal. I held the phone away from my ear and stared at the wallpaper, listening to her rage echo like waves against cliffs. I wanted to shout back to remind her that this was my life, my choice. But I stayed quiet because silence sometimes slices deeper than words. Still, that silence had its cost. She hung up on me with a finality that felt like slamming a coffin shut. My phone didn't buzz for days afterward. It was eerie, like I'd been exiled from my own bloodline. And part of me wondered, had I done the right thing, or had I crossed a line that could never be walked back? People still debate whether freedom is worth the price of isolation. One night, sitting in the glow of my secondhand lamp, I replayed her face in my mind. The outrage, the disbelief, the sense of entitlement wrapped in wounded pride. And I whispered into the empty room, yes, I sold it first. Not as a confession, not as an apology. Just as a truth I needed to speak, even if no one was listening. The silence after her last phone call didn't last long. News spreads in families faster than mold spreads in damp corners, and soon the sale of my house had become the main course at every whispered phone call, group chat, and passive-aggressive family dinner. It wasn't just my daughter anymore. My son, my siblings, even distant cousins suddenly had opinions about a property they never mowed the lawn for, never paid a tax bill on, never winterized when the pipes groaned like dying whales. Funny how when there's a whiff of inheritance, everyone becomes an expert in real estate and morality. I could feel the ripples of resentment reaching me from across town. My sister left me a long voicemail where she reminded me of childhood sacrifices, as if the fact she once lent me her sweater gave her a vote on my property decades later. My son emailed me in all caps an email, not even a call, asking how could you sell our family home. I read it, laughed out loud, and then felt guilty for laughing, because beneath his rage I knew there was fear. Fear that his slice of pie had just vanished. Family reactions are like dominoes. One falls and the others line up to crash behind it. The more they talked to each other, the more dramatic the story became. I had secretly sold the house. I had betrayed my bloodline. I had robbed my own children of their rightful legacy. By the time the gossip reached the outer ring of cousins, I half expected someone to accuse me of selling the place to a cartel. What no one wanted to hear was the simple truth: I was drowning. A mainstream fact that people forget is that in the U.S., nearly 1 in 3 seniors still carries mortgage debt well into retirement. I was one of them. I had a choice: keep the house and slowly suffocate under bills, or sell it and give myself a fighting chance. I chose air over tradition. People still debate whether survival choices excuse betrayal, but let me tell you, when you can't breathe, you stop worrying about etiquette. My daughter, of course, didn't see it that way. She rallied the troops, telling anyone who would listen that I had acted recklessly, selfishly, even cruelly. And part of me wonders if she really believed that, or if she just liked being the spokesperson for justice. Families often assign roles: the responsible one, the black sheep, the martyr. She slipped into the role of prosecutor so smoothly, I almost admired it. Almost. The worst moment was the Sunday dinner that turned into a tribunal. I agreed to go partly out of guilt, partly out of curiosity. I walked into my sister's house, casserole dish in hand, like it was a peace offering, and I knew immediately I was walking into an ambush. The air was thick, voices, hushed eyes sharp. They had gathered like wolves who had rehearsed their lines. My daughter spoke first. She stood up, cleared her throat, and announced that what I had done was an attack on family unity. I almost choked on my own laugh. Attack? I wasn't carrying bombs, I was carrying receipts. But I sat quietly, letting her parade her indignation in front of the others. Then my son chimed in, reminding everyone how much time he had spent fixing the gutters as a teenager, as if that labor entitled him to partial ownership decades later. Here's the fringe fact that came to mind in ancient Celtic tribes: property wasn't inherited by children, but by the entire clan. Land was communal, and no one person could decide its fate. Sitting there staring at my son's flushed face, I realized my family had somehow adopted that tribal mindset. My house was no longer just mine, it was a symbol of shared history. But symbols don't pay property taxes. I defended myself. Calmly, I thought. I explained the debt, the stress, the sleepless nights, the way bills stacked like bricks on my chest. I told them I had chosen to live, not to drown, and instead of sympathy, I saw disbelief, even disgust. My daughter shook her head. My sister whispered something under her breath, and my son slammed his fork against his plate. It was theater, and I was the villain. The room buzzed with accusation. You didn't consult us. You robbed us of memories. You made us look like fools. Each sentence was another stone hurled at me, and I sat there nodding, knowing no explanation would pierce the shield of their outrage. Families love the illusion of democracy, but when one person makes a unilateral choice, the others call it betrayal. People still debate whether parents owe their children consultation rights on financial decisions, but I've always believed consultation without contribution is just noise. As the dinner dragged on, I caught myself noticing trivial things: the flickering candle in the corner, the gravy stain on the tablecloth, the way my granddaughter sat quietly scrolling on her phone, detached from the storm. I wanted to laugh again. This grand family trial was happening, and the youngest generation didn't even look up. Maybe she understood what the rest didn't, that houses crumble, but people choose whether to crumble with them. By the time dessert was served, I was exhausted. My daughter gave one final speech about restoring family trust, which basically meant undoing my sale. She actually demanded that I try to reverse it, as if real estate was a pawn shop. I told her flatly that it wasn't possible, that the papers were signed sealed and binding. Her face twisted and she hissed under her breath, "You'll regret this." That phrase stuck to me like a burr on clothing. Regret is a funny word, slippery and heavy all at once. Would I regret saving myself? Would I regret losing them in the process? People still debate whether regret is a sign of weakness or wisdom. I left the dinner early casserole dish still full because no one touched it. Driving back to my small apartment, headlights flickering past, I felt the weight of the family's disapproval pressing down like a second seatbelt. But under that pressure was something else too, relief. I had faced them. I had stood in their storm and refused to bend. And while it hurt, it also felt like breaking free. Later that night, lying in bed, I replayed my daughter's words, "You'll regret this." Maybe she was right. Maybe regret would crawl in slowly, one lonely holiday at a time. But I whispered into the dark, I already regret nothing. It wasn't bravado. It was the quiet certainty that comes when you've chosen survival over spectacle. And here's your third joke of the night after all that drama, after all that fiery condemnation. Do you know what I dreamed about? Not the house, not the family tribunal. I dreamed about eating pie alone peacefully without anyone fighting over who got the biggest slice. Maybe that's what freedom really looks like. The weeks that followed were quieter, though not in the way peace feels quiet. It was the silence of doors closed, calls ignored, and invitations that never came. I had effectively exiled myself from the family kingdom, and yet sitting in my small apartment surrounded by unpacked boxes, I realized I wasn't mourning the house itself. I was mourning the idea of belonging. A house can be replaced, a family not so much. But let me tell you, the two can get tangled until you can't tell if you're grieving the building or the people who once filled it. Moving into this new space was humbling. Everything about it was scaled down: the kitchen, the bathroom, the closet that barely fit half my clothes. I had traded polished hardwood for creaky linoleum and manicured hedges for a shared hallway that always smelled faintly of bleach and fried fish. But when I turned the lock on my new door for the first time, a strange relief washed over me. There was no porch light to leave on for ungrateful guests, no family photos staring from every wall like silent judges. Just me, a futon, and a chipped coffee table I picked up from the thrift store. People still debate whether solitude is a curse or a gift. Of course, the family didn't see it that way. My daughter called once more, not to reconcile, but to warn me. She said, "You've humiliated us, not me us." The way she clung to the collective like her self-worth was stitched into the family's reputation made me wonder how fragile her pride really was. And here's a mainstream fact: sociologists point out that families often equate property with identity. Selling a family home feels like selling the family's story. My daughter wasn't grieving the bricks. She was grieving the narrative she thought she'd inherit. Meanwhile, I was learning to live small. I bought fewer groceries, cooked one-pan meals, laughed at how my new oven tilted slightly to the left so everything baked unevenly. I made jokes to myself like, well, even my brownies are leaning out of guilt. The adjustment wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Sometimes, though, the humiliation sneaked in. When old friends asked where I was living now, I'd mutter downsized and quickly change the subject. Downsizing carries a sting in our culture. People admire ambition, but whisper about contraction. Still, what no one says out loud is that sometimes contraction is survival. Like a turtle pulling into its shell, I wasn't giving up. I was just protecting what little I had left. There was one evening when I tried to recreate old rituals just for myself. I cooked the same Sunday roast I used to make for the family. The smell filled my tiny apartment thick with nostalgia, but eating it alone felt absurd, like throwing a wedding with only the groom. I laughed at myself, then cried a little, then laughed again at the fact that I was crying. It's bizarre how grief and humor sit side by side at the same table, both demanding a portion of your heart. I thought about family rituals more deeply that night. Every culture has them: meals, holidays, ceremonies that glue people together. But when the glue is resentment, those rituals start to crack. People still debate whether family traditions hold people hostage or keep them whole. I was beginning to think both could be true. My daughter, of course, wasn't done. Even from a distance, she tried to make her presence felt. She started organizing family gatherings without me sending photos afterward to prove how united they all were without the traitor. At first, it stung. But then I noticed something in those pictures. Forced smiles, stiff shoulders, eyes darting toward the absence in the room. Families can pretend unity, but absence echoes louder than presence. One day I overheard my neighbors talking through the thin walls about their own family drama. A son had moved back in with his parents, bringing debt and chaos with him. The father joked, "We should start charging rent for tears." I chuckled quietly because it struck me how universal these battles are. My story wasn't unique. It was just raw. Every family has its storm, and mine just happened to center on a sold house. Here's a fringe fact that lodged itself in my brain in some Scandinavian countries. When parents downsize, it's seen as a responsible step, not a betrayal. Children expect it, even support it. Imagine if my daughter had been born there. Maybe she would have applauded me instead of condemning me. Or maybe betrayal is betrayal, no matter what the passport says. There were lighter moments, too. I tried to decorate my new place with plants, thinking a little greenery would soften the walls. But within 2 weeks, I had murdered a cactus. Yes, a cactus. I laughed until tears rolled down my face, imagining my daughter's voice. "You couldn't even keep a cactus alive, and you think you can handle life alone." I pictured her saying it, and somehow the imagined insult turned into a joke only I got to enjoy. Still, the distance grew heavier with time. Holidays came and no one invited me. Birthdays passed and my phone stayed silent. It was exile, but not total. My granddaughter sent me a text once, just a simple hi. That one word felt like a lifeline tossed across an ocean. She didn't take sides, didn't accuse, didn't demand, just hi. It reminded me that bloodlines can fracture, but small threads remain. The real twist came a few weeks later when I received a letter. A real letter handwritten in ink from my daughter. It wasn't an apology. It was a declaration. She wrote that she was consulting a lawyer to see if the sale could be contested, reversed, or at least punished. My stomach twisted, not because I feared losing the case. I had every legal right, but because it showed how far she was willing to drag this war. Families fight over wills when parents die. Mine was fighting me while I was still alive. People still debate whether it's crueler to be betrayed after death or before. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into a drawer, and sat quietly for a long time. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge. I thought about how small my world had become, smaller space, smaller meals, smaller family circle. But inside that shrinking, there was still a seed of defiance. I whispered into the quiet, "You wanted the keys. I sold the whole door. And here's the joke to leave you with tonight." I looked at the drawer holding her letter, then at my dead cactus, and thought, at least the cactus can't sue me. Old rituals have a way of haunting you, even when you think you've escaped them. The first big holiday after I sold the house was proof of that. I didn't plan on celebrating. I told myself I'd treat it like any other day, cook a small meal, maybe watch an old movie, maybe even light a candle if I was feeling nostalgic. But then the memories came rushing in uninvited, like stubborn relatives who never knock. I could almost hear the sound of my family cramming into the old dining room chairs, scraping against hardwood laughter, mixed with low mutters, the clinking of cutlery on plates. I remembered the cruel laugh my son once threw at me in that room, the same one that still rings in my ears like a broken bell. Remember that cruel laugh in the hotel lobby? It had the same rhythm, like a soundtrack of humiliation. I tried to shake it off, but in my apartment's silence, memories have a way of turning the volume up. The holiday passed slowly, and by evening, I was restless. I poured myself a glass of wine, raised it to the empty room, and toasted to broken traditions and clean escapes. It wasn't funny, but it made me chuckle anyway. Humor is a bandage thin, but better than nothing. Families thrive on rituals, and when you step out of them, you feel like a ghost at your own table. Sociologists say traditions bind families, but they also trap them. People still debate whether holding on to traditions is loyalty or just fear of change. That night, I thought about cultural customs around family gatherings. In Italy, for example, Sunday family meals are practically sacred. In some households, skipping them is seen as rebellion. Maybe my daughter felt the same way about our rituals. Me selling the house wasn't just a financial act. It was rebellion against the sacred rhythm she thought we owed each other. The next week, she made sure I felt her disapproval. She sent photos of the family celebrating in what used to be my house. They'd managed to convince the new owners, distant relatives of my ex-husband's side, to host them for one last dinner before renovations. There, they all were, seated in my old dining room, smiling stiffly for the camera, and front and center was my daughter holding up a glass of wine like a queen reclaiming her throne. I stared at that photo until my vision blurred. It was like watching strangers reenact my life. I wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to scream. Instead, I made another joke to myself. They should have invited me to at least ghost the dinner. Every good haunting needs its star. Humor again, thin as tissue. But it kept me from breaking. Soon after, the phone calls started again, not from my daughter this time, but from cousins and distant relatives who had heard the story and wanted to offer their unsolicited advice. One told me I should have waited until I died to sell the house, as though my funeral would have been a convenient signing date. Another insisted I could have just asked the kids to chip in, as if children are ever eager to pay their parents' bills. The advice came with a side of judgment, the kind that sticks like oil on your hands, no matter how hard you wash. And then came the inheritance talk. My daughter brought it up like a dagger, sharp and deliberate. She reminded me of what she called her rights. But here's an odd piece of information I stumbled across once. In some cultures, parents aren't legally obligated to leave anything to their children. In fact, in the United States, you can disinherit a child entirely with a few exceptions. Of course, try explaining that to a furious daughter who believes property is a birthright. She didn't want the law. She wanted the moral high ground. People still debate whether parents owe their children an inheritance or whether inheritance is just a cultural illusion. As the weeks went on, gatherings grew tense. Even small ones, like when my niece invited me to coffee, were laced with whispered questions. Why didn't you tell her first? Don't you think you were too harsh? It felt like every cup of tea came with a spoonful of interrogation. I started avoiding invitations altogether. Solitude was heavy, but at least it wasn't cross-examining me. Still, I couldn't avoid everyone. At one particularly awkward Sunday lunch, hosted by a friend who meant well, my daughter showed up unannounced. She walked in, sat across from me, and stared like she was daring me to blink first. She didn't mention the house. She didn't have to. Her silence was heavier than any accusation. We ate in brittle quiet, every scrape of the fork a gunshot. I broke first. I told her she looked tired, that maybe she was carrying too much anger for one person. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. She said, "You don't get to talk about what I carry. You abandoned us. Us, always the collective identity she hid behind." I wanted to tell her the truth, that I sold the house not to abandon her, but to save myself. But in that moment, I realized it didn't matter. She wasn't listening for explanations. She was listening for surrender, and I wasn't about to give it. That night, I sat by my window watching cars flicker past on the street below headlights like comets. I thought about how families fracture, how betrayals carve trenches that no ritual can fill. And I thought about how easy it is for children to rewrite their parents' choices into stories of cruelty. Maybe I was cruel, or maybe I was just tired. People still debate whether self-preservation is selfish or sacred. Here's your joke for tonight. I looked around my tiny apartment at the dead cactus, the crooked oven, the thrift store table, and thought, maybe I should start charging admission. At least then the family drama would pay rent. The truth is, rituals and rifts are two sides of the same coin. One binds you, the other breaks you, and sometimes you only realize which side you've been living on when it's already too late. It didn't take long for the inheritance question to stop being whispered and start being shouted. My daughter wasn't content with storming out or throwing cutting words over coffee anymore. She wanted a battle, and she wanted it with paperwork. One morning, I found a thick envelope shoved under my apartment door. Inside, a letter from her lawyer. She was formally contesting the sale of the house, calling it fraudulent and in violation of her future rights. I laughed out loud when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. You can't sue someone for selling what belongs to them, at least not in this country. Still, the letter carried a weight heavier than the ink on its pages. It was proof that the war had gone public. Families rarely collapse quietly. More often, they unravel under the fluorescent lights of legal offices, bank counters, and courtrooms. I remembered reading once that in China, children are legally required to visit their aging parents or risk fines. Imagine that family loyalty by law. Here, loyalty can't be forced, but money can weaponize love until even dinner conversations turn into depositions. People still debate whether laws around inheritance protect families or poison them. I sat in my kitchen holding that letter, the hum of the refrigerator buzzing like an insect in my ear, and I realized this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about power. My daughter wanted to prove she could bend me, force me, punish me. The house had become a battlefield, and she wanted to plant her flag on the ruins. I thought about calling her, thought about begging her to stop, but then a strange calm filled me. I didn't sell the house to hand my life back to her in pieces. I sold it to breathe, and I wasn't about to suffocate again. So I called my own lawyer. His voice was steady, professional, a little amused. "She doesn't have a case," he said, almost chuckling, "but she'll drag it out if she wants to make a point." Dragging it out, that was exactly her plan. Here's the mainstream fact you need to know: inheritance disputes are one of the top reasons siblings and parents never speak again. Courts are full of cases where children sue their living parents, convinced they are entitled to money before the will is even written. I had joined that unfortunate statistic. My daughter wasn't just my child anymore. She was my opponent. The weeks leading up to the first hearing were brutal. Phone calls went unanswered, texts were left unread, and in family circles, my name became something bitter on everyone's tongue. My son stopped calling altogether, not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted to stay out of it. Neutrality is its own betrayal, silence. I learned can cut deeper than screams. When the day of the hearing arrived, I dressed simply. Black pants, a cream blouse, hair tied back, no jewelry, no frills. I wanted to look like a woman who had nothing to hide. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal. There was my daughter seated across the aisle, her chin high, her lawyer whispering in her ear like a serpent. She wouldn't even look at me. And that hurt more than the lawsuit itself. The judge, tired-eyed and impatient, asked for statements. Her lawyer painted me as reckless, manipulative, even unstable. He argued that I had deprived her of her birthright. Birthright, such a medieval word. I almost laughed again, remembering how in some cultures, like among the Maasai, inheritance isn't about property at all. It's about cattle shared among the clan. Imagine dragging cows into a courtroom. People still debate whether the idea of inheritance is a human need for continuity or just a human addiction to control. My lawyer spoke next. Calm, factual, almost bored. He explained that the sale was legal, the papers airtight, the transaction complete. He reminded the court that parents are not obligated to gift their homes to their children. The judge nodded, scribbled a note, and sighed like he had seen the same play 1,000 times. And then it was over. Case dismissed. Just like that. My daughter's face twisted, her jaw, tightening eyes flashing like storm clouds. She stormed out without a word, heels cracking against the marble floor. I sat there, heart pounding, not from victory, but from grief. Winning felt like losing. That evening, I went home and poured myself another glass of wine. I sat by the window, the city lights flickering like tired stars, and thought about what had just happened. My daughter had dragged me into court to fight for something that never belonged to her, and I had defended myself not as her mother, but as her opponent. That shift, the line from parent to adversary, is one I'll never forget. Here's the fringe piece of information that stuck with me. In some ancient cultures, when a child betrayed a parent, there was a ritual of symbolic death, where the parent would declare the child dead to the family. It sounds cruel, but it was their way of severing ties permanently. Sitting in my apartment, staring at the city, I wondered if my daughter had already performed that ritual on me. Had she declared me dead in her heart the moment she filed those papers? Still, life has its strange ways of softening even the sharpest edges. A week after the hearing, I ran into an old neighbor at the grocery store. She smiled warmly, asked how I was doing, and before I could answer, she said, "I admire you. Most parents cave under pressure. You stood your ground." Her words were simple, but they wrapped around me like a blanket. Maybe I wasn't just the villain of this story. Maybe I was also the survivor. Later that night, I thought about that cruel laugh in the hotel lobby, the way my son once ridiculed me, the way my daughter now tried to crush me in court. Betrayal has many sounds, some sharp, some quiet, but they all echo in the same hollow space. And I realized something important. I might not be able to silence those echoes, but I could decide how much of my future they would fill. So here's your lighthearted moment for the night I opened the fridge, found nothing but leftover noodles and a half-empty bottle of soda, and thought, well, if I've been declared dead to my family, at least the afterlife comes with carbs. After the courtroom debacle, I thought maybe my daughter would cool down, lick her wounds in private, and let the storm pass. But if anything, the defeat seemed to energize her. Losing didn't humble her. It hardened her. She began plotting revenge in ways that didn't involve paperwork. I could feel it in the way her silence lingered, like a fog in the way distant relatives suddenly stopped calling me, and the strange messages I'd get from friends saying, "She's been talking." Talking, of course, meant spinning her own narrative, painting me as unstable, selfish, and unfit to manage my own life. It was less about law now and more about reputation. Families have always fought not just over property, but over legacy. It's a mainstream fact that siblings will often argue more about who was loved more than who gets more money. In my case, the argument wasn't about love. It was about loyalty, about her desperate need to prove she had the upper hand. People still debate whether family wars are truly about money or just about power disguised as money. I could tell with her it was both. The first time I realized she had escalated was when my landlord knocked on my apartment door, uneasy, and told me he'd received a call from someone claiming I was mentally unfit to live alone. He didn't believe it, but the seed had been planted. I laughed after he left, though the laugh was bitter. This was her new plan. If she couldn't have the house, she'd try to have my independence. It reminded me of an odd cultural fact. In some parts of India, it's common for children to legally declare their parents incompetent if they believe they are mismanaging property. Imagine that being parented by your own children in front of a judge. I told myself not to take it personally, but of course I did. When your own child questions your sanity, it's not just an attack on your mind, it's an attack on your identity. I lay awake that night listening to the hum of traffic outside, wondering if she really believed I was losing it, or if this was just another tactic in her crusade. Then came the family dinners I wasn't invited to. I'd see the pictures posted online, my children, my grandchildren, even my cousins, all smiling stiffly around tables filled with food I used to cook. And always, my daughter at the center radiating control. She was rewriting the script, casting herself as the matriarch while I became the ghost. Remember how I joked about haunting their dinners? It turns out she was doing the haunting for me, keeping me absent but ever present in the subtext. One evening, I ran into my niece at a cafe. She leaned in, whispered that my daughter had been telling everyone I'd lost my grip. She didn't say it with malice, more with pity, like she wanted me to know what was happening behind my back. I sipped my coffee, forced a smile, and replied, "If losing your grip means not being strangled by the past, then maybe I'm guilty." We both laughed awkwardly, but the truth sat between us like a heavy stone. The strange part is that despite all her attacks, a part of me still wanted reconciliation. That's the cruel trick of motherhood. You can be stabbed 100 times and still crave the hug of the one holding the knife. People still debate whether unconditional love is strength or weakness. For me, it felt like both. The real confrontation came in the most unlikely place, a hotel lobby. I was there to meet an old friend for coffee. The lobby was bustling, filled with clinking glasses and the low murmur of travelers checking in. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of her laugh. Not a warm laugh, not a kind one. A cruel laugh, sharp and theatrical, designed to draw attention. She was standing with two of her cousins, clearly telling a story at my expense. I caught words crazy, sold out, betrayed. And then her eyes flicked up, locked on mine, and she laughed louder. That laugh cut me deeper than the lawsuit. It was public humiliation, a declaration that I was no longer the matriarch, but the punchline. People turned to look curious, amused. My cheeks burned, and for a moment I thought I might crumble right there among the potted palms and polished marble floors. But then something inside me hardened. I walked past her head high like I didn't hear a thing. That was my revenge dignity in the face of her theater. Later, alone in my apartment, I replayed that laugh again and again. It echoed off the walls like a ghost I couldn't shake. I thought about how families use humiliation as a weapon, how shame is often the sharpest tool in the box. I remembered a fringe fact I once read in some tribal communities. Public shaming was used instead of prison, the idea being that humiliation corrected behavior faster than punishment. Sitting there, I realized my daughter had adopted the same tactic. She didn't want my money anymore, she wanted me erased. But I wasn't going to disappear. I started documenting everything, her calls, her threats, even the way she'd spread rumors. Not because I wanted another court case, but because writing it down gave me control. It turned chaos into a story, one I could own, instead of one she narrated. Maybe that's why I'm telling it to you now. Here's your lighter moment for tonight. After that cruel lobby scene, I came home and tripped over my own dead cactus, the one I still hadn't thrown out. Lying on the floor, tangled with a plant that refused to live, I burst out laughing. The cactus was my perfect metaphor, prickly, stubborn, half-dead, but somehow still managing to hurt me. Just like family. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I whispered into the dark, "Let her laugh. Let her poison my name." I sold the house, not my soul. And in that quiet defiance, I felt something close to peace. Winter crept in like an unwelcome guest, and with it came a silence so thick it felt like a second skin. My daughter didn't call, didn't write, didn't even try to show up in person anymore. After the hotel lobby humiliation, it was as if she had drawn a line in the snow and decided I no longer existed. At first, I thought the silence might soothe me, but it only echoed louder than her cruel laugh. There's a strange ache in being ignored. It gnaws differently than anger. Anger, at least, is engagement. Silence is erasure. I spent long evenings in my apartment staring at the ceiling, counting cracks like constellations, wondering if she did the same in her own home. Did she ever miss me, or had I become just a cautionary tale she retold at family dinners? Families fracture in different ways. Some explode, some fade, and some freeze. Mine had chosen the frozen silence of a winter that wouldn't thaw. People still debate whether estrangement is an act of survival or of cowardice. I was living inside that debate every day. One evening, I found myself rereading her letter from the lawyer, tracing my finger over the ink as though touching the words might make them kinder. Instead, the words felt like sharp stones. Fraudulent, unfit, deprived. Words written about me by my own child. I wondered how many other parents had sat in dim apartments, staring at similar accusations, realizing their family bond had turned into a legal battlefield. It's a mainstream fact that more than 25% of adult estrangements are tied to financial disputes, especially inheritance. I was just another statistic now. But silence gave me space to think. With no dinners to attend, no phone calls to defend, I started to reflect on my own mistakes. I remembered moments when I clung too tightly to control, when I snapped at my children instead of listening when I thought providing was enough, but forgot to nurture. Maybe selling the house was just the final straw in a pattern of choices that left my daughter feeling unheard. I don't excuse her cruelty, but I can't deny my part either. Families are like mirrors. You see yourself reflected sometimes in ways you'd rather not. I also thought about customs across the world. In Ghana, for example, funerals are grand events, and inheritance is often decided by extended families rather than direct children. Property can shift unexpectedly, leaving children shocked, but culturally resigned. I wondered if I had grown up with that system, would my daughter's rage even exist? Or would she have already accepted that the family story doesn't always end with her holding the keys? People still debate whether cultural customs make loss easier or harder to bear. The first snowfall came one quiet evening, soft flakes drifting past my window, blanketing the noisy city in sudden calm. I watched the snow pile on rooftops and sidewalks and thought about how clean everything looks under white. The house I sold would be covered too, its roof heavy with snow, hiding all the cracks, stains, and broken shingles. My daughter probably still imagined it as a symbol of permanence, not realizing houses like people sag under weight until they're buried. There was one night when loneliness broke me. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, family reunions, all smiles and closeness that now felt staged. I zoomed in on my daughter's face in one picture, her smile wide, her eyes lit. I whispered, "Where did you go?" And for a moment, I thought about calling her, about apologizing, even if I didn't mean it, just to end the silence. But then I remembered her laugh in the hotel lobby, sharp as glass, and I closed my phone. Sometimes clinging to dignity is the only warmth you have left. Still, not everything in that winter was bleak. I found small rituals for myself. I'd cook soup and let it simmer all day, filling the apartment with rich aromas. I'd walk in the snow, my boots crunching, breath clouding in the air, and remind myself I was still alive, still moving. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper where no one could twist them into weapons. In those pages, I reclaimed my story page by page, even as my family erased me from theirs. Here's your odd laugh for the night. One morning, my neighbor knocked on my door holding a package meant for me. He handed it over, winked, and said, "At least someone remembers you live here." I laughed so hard I nearly cried because isn't that the truth? Sometimes strangers see you clearer than your own blood. The silence stretched for months. No calls, no visits, no messages, just me, the hum of my heater, the creak of the floorboards. But silence can be fertile ground too. In that stillness, I began to ask myself questions I had avoided. What if reconciliation never came? What if the daughter I raised was gone for good? And most haunting, what if this was always how our story was meant to end? People still debate whether time heals all wounds or just teaches you to live with the scars. Watching the snow melt outside my window, I realized time wasn't healing anything. It was just moving, carrying me with it further and further from the family I once thought was unshakable. And yet, despite everything, despite the lawsuit, the laughter, the silence, I still loved her. That's the cruel magic of parenthood. You can be cast out, humiliated, even erased, but love lingers like a stubborn ghost that refuses to leave. By the time spring arrived, the silence between us had hardened into something permanent, like concrete poured overnight. Months had gone by without a word from my daughter, and yet she lived in my head as loudly as ever. I'd wake up in the morning and catch myself rehearsing conversations I would never have, imagining her voice, her accusations, my defenses. It was as if she had taken up residence in my thoughts, even after evicting me from her life. I tried to fill the days with little routines. I joined a book club, though I spent most of the meetings staring at the covers instead of reading. I took long walks through the park, watching young families laughing together on picnic blankets. Each giggle from a child felt like a knife, reminding me what had slipped from my grasp. Family, after all, is less about blood than about time spent, and my time with mine had expired like sour milk. Sociologists say that estrangement between parents and children is far more common than people admit. Some studies suggest nearly 1 in 10 families are fractured this way. People still debate whether that number is shocking or inevitable. In those long months, I thought often about respect. My daughter believed I had disrespected her by selling the house without consultation. But respect, at least in my eyes, was about more than property. It was about acknowledging a person's right to make choices about their own life. Wasn't it disrespectful for her to treat me like a vault instead of a mother? Wasn't it cruel for her to drag me into court, to humiliate me in public, to erase me from our family dinners? The word respect became a puzzle I couldn't solve, with each piece cutting at my fingers. One memory came back again and again the first time she borrowed my car as a teenager. She had begged, pleaded, promised to take care of it, and she did for one night. But when she returned, the gas tank was empty and the back seat was cluttered with fast food wrappers. I had laughed, then shrugged it off. But looking back, maybe that moment was a small warning she never saw resources as shared responsibilities, only as things to be consumed. The absence of my children left me with more time than I knew what to do with. I started going to the library, sitting in the quiet corners where no one asked questions. I read about family structures in other cultures, trying to make sense of my own unraveling. One article explained how in some Native American traditions, homes are considered part of the tribe rather than private property. Selling one would be unthinkable, but so would fighting over it. It belonged to everyone, and thus to no one. Maybe that was the root of our conflict. My daughter believed the house was tribal, while I knew it was mine. People still debate whether property divides or unites, but I'd lived the answer. Loneliness has a way of sharpening your memories. I began to replay not just recent betrayals, but old ones. I remembered birthdays when my children forgot to call, Christmases where arguments spoiled the meal, the way my daughter's eyes sometimes glinted with disdain long before the house was even a question. Maybe the betrayal didn't begin with the sale. It began years ago, in tiny fractures that widened until the house simply became the excuse to break. Still, I kept hoping for a crack in the ice. I left my phone ringer on at night, just in case she called. I baked her favorite cake once and froze it, convincing myself I'd be ready if she came by. Hope is stubborn like weeds growing through concrete, even when you've sworn you're done watering the soil. Then one day the silence broke, not with a phone call, but with a package. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday, small and light, addressed in my daughter's handwriting. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was not an apology, not a letter, but a set of my old house keys. The same ones she had once demanded, the ones I told her no longer mattered. She had mailed them back to me like a cruel joke, a reminder of what was lost. No note, no explanation, just cold metal clinking in the box. I sat there staring at them, tears blurring my vision. The keys meant nothing. They opened, no doors unlocked, no safety. Yet holding them felt like holding our entire fractured history cold and heavy in my palm. I laughed bitterly, thinking of the irony. She had demanded them, fought over them, and now she threw them back at me as if to say, even if I had them, I wouldn't want them. I slipped the keys into a drawer beside her lawyer's letter and whispered to myself, so this is how respect ends, not with words, but with silence and a postage stamp. Here's your lighter moment for tonight. Later that evening, I used one of those useless keys as a bookmark in my novel. And I thought, well, at least now her betrayal is holding my place instead of taking my home. The final confrontation came on a gray afternoon, the kind of day when the sky feels heavy and the air carries a dampness that clings to your bones. I hadn't seen my daughter in months, hadn't heard her voice except in my own memory. And then suddenly, there she was knocking at the door of my little apartment as if nothing had happened. The sound startled me. For a moment, I thought it was just a neighbor delivering a package again. But when I opened the door and saw her standing there, arms folded, jaw set, eyes sharp, I knew this wasn't going to be casual. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The smell of rain clung to her coat, and droplets glittered in her hair like tiny diamonds. She looked around the small space, her lips twitching into a smirk that wasn't joy but judgment. "So this is what you traded it for?" she asked, her tone slicing through the air. I didn't answer. My silence was its own response. We stood there, the space between us thick with everything unsaid. Families fight in many ways, shouting silence, or that sharp, sarcastic knife of disapproval. This was the last kind. She wasn't yelling anymore. She was dissecting me with every glance, and in a strange way that cut deeper than her previous screams. I gestured for her to sit. She didn't. She kept standing, arms crossed like a fortress. Finally, she said it. "You humiliated me. You sold the house, erased our family history, and for what? For this." She gestured around the apartment as if it were a prison cell. I wanted to tell her the truth, that freedom sometimes looks small and humble, that survival doesn't always come wrapped in grandeur. Instead, I told her something simpler. I sold it because it was mine to sell. Her face twisted, a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Yours? You really believe that?" That house was ours. It was my childhood, my inheritance, my legacy. You stole it from me. That word again, stole. She said it as if I had broken into her bank account, as if I had robbed her blind in the night. I felt my chest tighten. Families often confuse memory with ownership. Just because you grew up somewhere doesn't mean you own it. But try explaining that to someone who's convinced the past belongs to them. People still debate whether parents owe their children legacy or just love. The conversation spiraled. She listed every sacrifice she claimed to have made, every moment she felt entitled to repayment. I listened not because I agreed, but because I was too tired to argue. I thought of an odd fact I once read in some parts of the Philippines. Children are expected by custom to repay their parents financially in adulthood. It's not seen as betrayal, it's seen as duty. Maybe my daughter had grown up with that mindset secretly stitched into her. Maybe she believed the house was her repayment, her reward. At one point, her voice cracked. She said, "Do you even realize what you've done? You've made me feel like a stranger in my own family." And in that moment, for the first time, I saw something beneath the rage fear. Fear of losing place, of losing identity, of losing the anchor that home had given her. That fear was wrapped in anger, but I could hear it trembling underneath. I softened then. I told her, "You're not a stranger. You'll never be a stranger to me, but you need to understand I couldn't keep drowning just to keep you floating. I had to save myself." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. She blinked hard as if refusing to give me that satisfaction. "You chose yourself over us," she whispered, and I whispered back, "For once, yes." We stood in silence. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room, that same sound that had been my companion all winter. She shifted on her feet, looked around again, and finally sighed. "You'll regret this," she said, echoing the same threat she had made months before. Maybe she thought it was a curse, but to me it sounded like a prediction. And here's the truth, maybe she was right. Maybe regret will seep into my bones one day, or maybe it already has in ways I don't want to admit. People still debate whether regret is proof of love or proof of weakness. I'm not sure anymore. After she left, closing the door with a slam that rattled my shelves, I sat on the couch, staring at the space she had just occupied. My heart pounded. My hands shook, but there was also relief. The confrontation had finally come, and it was over. Not resolved, not healed, but over. I reached into the drawer where I kept her lawyer's letter and those useless old house keys. I held them in my hand, cold metal, pressing against paper symbols of everything we had fought over, and then slowly I placed them back, shut the drawer, and whispered to the empty room, "I release this." Because maybe the truth is this: you can't win with family. You can't force them to see. You can't force them to forgive. Can't force them to love in the way you want. All you can do is tell your truth, stand your ground, and let the rest scatter where it will. Here's your lighter moment for tonight. After she left, I realized she'd tracked wet footprints all across my linoleum. I looked at them, sighed, and thought, well, at least she left me something. Free cleaning service. I laughed because sometimes all you can do is laugh. And so the story ends not with reunion, not with repair, but with release. I don't know if she'll ever forgive me or if I'll ever forgive her. But as the evening light dimmed and my little apartment grew quiet again, I felt something close to peace. As I slow my voice now softening with each word, I want to thank you for walking through this story with me. Family drama is never tidy. It doesn't wrap up in bows or neat conclusions. It lingers in the air like perfume that never fades, like a whisper you can't quite shake. If you've stayed until this final moment, maybe you've recognized a piece of yourself in my journey, whether it's the ache of estrangement, the sting of betrayal, or the fragile relief of setting yourself free. Life has a way of teaching us that love and pain often live side by side. My daughter may never understand why I sold that house, just as I may never fully understand why she fought me so fiercely for it. But that's the truth of family. We collide, we break, we forgive, or we don't. And still, the story carries on. As you turn off this video, I want you to remember this: houses crumble, but choices remain. And sometimes the bravest act of love is choosing yourself, even if it means letting go of others. To my subscribers and channel supporters, I whisper a special thank you. You are the ones who make these nights possible, who sit with me in the silence and let these stories unfold. You are my unexpected family, stitched together not by blood, but by listening. So now dim the lights, let the fan hum, and rest easy. Good night, my friends, until the next story.